Before time, before light, before the earth took shape, there was God. The book of Genesis opens with one of the most powerful declarations ever written. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Genesis 1:1. From nothing, he spoke the world into existence. Day by day, he brought order from chaos, light from darkness, sky from water, dry land from the deep. He filled the earth with living things, plants bearing seed, creatures of the sea, birds of the air, animals of every kind. And on the sixth day, he made something different. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Genesis 1:26. From the dust of the ground, God formed Adam and breathed life into him, and the man became a living soul. He placed him in the Garden of Eden, a paradise of beauty and provision. Every tree that was pleasant to the sight and good for food grew there. A river ran through it. God gave Adam meaningful work, to tend the garden and name the creatures. But something was missing. And the Lord, God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone." Genesis 2:18. So God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and from his rib he formed the woman, Eve. Adam recognized her immediately. Bone of his bones, flesh of his flesh. The two were united as one, dwelling in the garden in innocence and peace, unashamed before God and each other. But the serpent was crafty. He approached Eve with a question designed to plant doubt. "Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" Genesis 3:1. Eve knew the command. They were free to eat from any tree except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God had warned that eating from it would bring death. But the serpent twisted the truth. He told Eve she would not die, that God was withholding something from her, that eating would make her like God, knowing good and evil. She looked at the fruit. It was pleasant to the eyes. She took it, ate it, and gave some to Adam. And in that moment, everything changed. Their eyes were open. They saw their nakedness. They felt shame for the first time. When they heard God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, they hid themselves among the trees. God called out, "Where art thou?" Genesis 3:9. And the consequence of sin began to unfold. God confronted Adam, who blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. Judgment fell on each of them. The serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly. Eve would know pain in childbirth and sorrow in her relationships. Adam would work hard ground that fought against him, earning his bread by the sweat of his brow, until the day he returned to the dust from which he came. And they were driven from the garden, a cherub with a flaming sword placed at its entrance to guard the way back to the tree of life. It is a devastating moment, but even in the judgment, a word of grace appears. Speaking to the serpent, God declared, "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Genesis 3:15. This is what theologians call the proto-evangelium, the first gospel promise. From the very beginning, God was already pointing toward redemption. Outside the garden, life continued. Adam and Eve had children. First Cain, then Abel. Cain became a farmer, tilling the soil. Abel became a shepherd, tending his flocks. In time, both brought offerings to the Lord. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, the best he had. Cain brought an offering from the fruit of the ground, but God had regard for Abel's offering and not for Cain's. The text does not explain exactly why, but the difference seems to be one of the heart. Abel gave his best with faith. Cain did not. And when God did not accept his offering, Cain did not respond with humility or reflection. He was furious. His face fell. God came to him gently. Why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? Genesis 4:6-7. God was offering Cain a way back, a chance to examine his heart and make it right. But Cain chose a different path. He spoke to his brother Abel. When they were in the field together, Cain rose up and killed him. The world's first murder, brother against brother. God came again. Where is Abel thy brother? Cain answered with one of history's most chilling responses. I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? Genesis 4:9. But the ground itself cried out. The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Genesis 4:10. God cursed Cain. The ground would no longer yield its strength to him, and he would become a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain was afraid. He said anyone who found him would kill him. And so God placed a mark on Cain, not as a punishment, but as a protection. Even in judgment, God showed mercy. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. He built a city. His descendants multiplied, some becoming skilled craftsmen and musicians, others spreading violence across the land. The line of Cain grew in knowledge and power, but drifted further from God. Meanwhile, Adam and Eve had another son, Seth, and it was through Seth's line that the story of redemption would continue. As the chapter closes, a quiet but significant note appears. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Genesis 4:26. Even in a broken world, there were those who sought God. As generations passed, humanity multiplied across the earth. But along with growth came corruption. The wickedness of man became great. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. God looked upon the earth he had made and grieved. He determined to bring judgment. But there was one man who was different. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God. Genesis 6:9. God came to Noah and told him what was coming. A flood that would cover the earth and destroy every living thing under heaven. But Noah and his family would be spared. God gave him precise instructions. Build an ark of gopher wood, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Seal it with pitch inside and out. Bring 2 of every living creature aboard, male and female, along with food enough for all. Noah did exactly as God commanded, every detail. And when the ark was ready, God told him to bring his family and the animals inside. For in 7 days the rain would begin. And the Lord shut him in. Genesis 7:16. The flood came. The fountains of the great deep burst open. The windows of heaven were opened. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rose until they covered the highest mountains. Every living thing on the face of the earth perished, except for Noah, his family, and the creatures with him in the ark. The waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. Then God remembered Noah. The waters began to recede. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah sent out a raven and then a dove. The first time, the dove returned, no place to land. The second time, she returned with an olive branch in her beak. The waters were abating. The third time, she did not return. The earth was dry. God told Noah to come out, to bring his family, all the living creatures, and to fill the earth once more. Noah's first act on dry land was to build an altar and offer burnt offerings to the Lord. And God responded with a promise. He would never again destroy all living things with a flood. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. Genesis 9:13. The rainbow, the sign of God's covenant, a promise written across the sky for every generation that followed. The flood was judgment, yes, but the rainbow was grace. After the flood, the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the fathers of nations. Their descendants spread and multiplied, forming the peoples and languages and lands that would fill the known world. Genesis chapter 10, often called the Table of Nations, traces this spread. 70 nations in all, a tapestry of humanity fanning out from a single family. But not everyone moved outward right away. For a time, the whole earth shared one language and one speech. And as people journeyed eastward, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They had an idea, and it was ambitious. Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name. Genesis 11:4, the Tower of Babel. They would build it out of brick and tar, man-made materials for a man-made monument. Their stated goal was not to honor God, but to make a name for themselves, to unify, to reach, to rise. God came down to see what they were building. His response was not what they expected. He did not destroy the tower. Instead, he confused their language so that they could no longer understand one another, and scattered them across the face of the earth. The city was called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. Genesis 11:9. The tower project was abandoned, the people scattered. And yet, even here, the plan of God was moving. Humanity was spreading as God had intended, filling the earth, just as he had commanded from the beginning. The chapter ends with a genealogy tracing the line of Shem to a man named Terah, and Terah's son, Abram. The stage is being set. The great story of redemption is about to begin in earnest. Out of the scattered nations, God chose one man, not because of what Abram had done, but because of what God intended to do through him. The call was direct and total. Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. Genesis 12:1. God made him 3 staggering promises. He would be the father of a great nation. His name would be made great, and through him, all the families of the earth would be blessed. Abram was 75 years old. He had no children. His wife, Sarai, was barren. And yet, Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him. Genesis 12:4. He packed up everything and left, not knowing where he was going. The road was not easy. A famine drove him to Egypt, where fear led him to claim Sarai was only his sister, a half-truth that nearly brought disaster. He and his nephew Lot eventually parted ways because their herds had grown too large to share the same land. Abram let Lot choose first, and Lot chose the well-watered plains near Sodom. Abram settled in Canaan. God came to Abram again and again, renewing and expanding the covenant. He showed him the stars. Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. Genesis 15:5. In a formal covenant ceremony, God caused a deep sleep to fall on Abram, passed between the divided animals as a smoking furnace and burning lamp, and bound himself to his promise. But the years passed, and still there was no child. Sarai, impatient and hurting, offered her Egyptian maidservant Hagar to Abram so that he might have a son through her. Hagar conceived, and Ishmael was born. He would be loved, and God would bless him too. But Ishmael was not the child of the promise. When Abram was 99 years old, God appeared to him again. He changed his name from Abram, Exalted Father, to Abraham, father of a multitude. He gave Sarai the new name Sarah. He established circumcision as the sign of the covenant for every male among Abraham's descendants. And he promised something that seemed impossible. Sarah herself would bear a son, and they would call his name Isaac. This covenant was not contingent on Abraham's performance. God initiated it. God sustained it. God would fulfill it. And in the waiting and wandering, Abraham was being shaped into the man of faith he would become. 3 visitors came to Abraham's tent one day as he sat in the heat of the day. He ran to meet them, bowed low, and offered them rest and a meal. Abraham did not yet know he was entertaining God and 2 angels, but he offered them the best he had. As they ate, one of the visitors made an announcement. Sarah would have a son by this time next year. Sarah, listening from inside the tent, laughed. She was old. Her husband was old. How could this be? But the visitor asked, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Genesis 18:14. Sarah laughed. Then, afraid, she denied it. But God knew. After the meal, God revealed something to Abraham. He was going to investigate the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, for their sin was very grave. Abraham's nephew Lot lived in Sodom, and Abraham did something remarkable. He stood before God and interceded, bargaining with holy boldness. What if there were 50 righteous in the city? 45? 40? He worked his way down to 10. God agreed. For 10 righteous people, he would spare the city. But 10 could not be found. 2 angels arrived in Sodom that evening. Lot welcomed them and brought them into his home. But the men of the city surrounded the house, demanding that Lot send out his guests. The wickedness of Sodom was not hidden. It was brazen and violent. The angels struck the mob with blindness. Then they told Lot to gather his family and flee. God was about to destroy the city. Lot warned his sons-in-law, but they thought he was joking. At dawn, the angels took Lot's hands and the hands of his wife and 2 daughters and led them out of the city by force. "Escape for thy life," they said. "Look not behind thee." Genesis 19:17. Fire and brimstone rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Lot and his 2 daughters survived. Abraham, standing at a distance, looked out over the valley and saw smoke rising like the smoke of a furnace. The years continued. God kept his promise. Sarah conceived, and in her old age bore a son. They named him Isaac, which means he laughs. The laughter of disbelief had become the laughter of joy. But the greatest test was still to come. God spoke to Abraham, "Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering." Genesis 22:2. It was an impossible command. Isaac was the child of promise, the one through whom all of God's covenantal purposes flowed. And yet Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went. 3 days' journey to the mountain. Abraham told his servants to wait. I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. Genesis 22:5. He believed God would provide. He believed somehow that even if Isaac died, God could raise him up, because God's promise could not fail. Isaac carried the wood up the mountain. He asked, "Where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb." Genesis 22:7-8. Abraham built the altar. He bound his son. He raised the knife. And in that moment, the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Lay not thine hand upon the lad." Genesis 22:12. Abraham had not withheld his son. God had seen his faith. And there in the thicket was a ram, caught by its horns, the substitute God had provided. The place was called Jehovah-Jireh. The Lord will provide. A promise that has echoed through Scripture and through the lives of God's people ever since. Sarah lived to be 127 years old, and when she died, Abraham mourned deeply. He purchased a burial cave at Machpelah from the Hittites, paying the full price in silver so that no one could ever claim it was given to him. It became the first permanent piece of land the family owned in Canaan, the land of the promise. Abraham was old, and there was one more thing he needed to see to before he died: a wife for Isaac. He did not want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman. He called his oldest and most trusted servant and sent him back to the old country, to Abraham's family in Mesopotamia, to find a wife from his own people. The servant went, praying the whole way. He asked God for a specific sign. The woman who offered water not only to him, but also to his camels, would be the one. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with a water jar on her shoulder. She offered him a drink. And then, without being asked, she said she would draw water for his camels too. And she did, until all 10 camels had drunk their fill. It was the sign, exactly as asked. Rebekah was from Abraham's own family, the granddaughter of Abraham's brother, Nahor. She agreed to go with the servant and become the wife of a man she had never met. Her family blessed her. "Be thou the mother of thousands of millions, and let thy seed possess the gate of those which hate them." Genesis 24:60. Isaac went out into the field at evening to meditate, and he looked up and saw the camels coming. When Rebekah saw him, she dismounted and asked the servant who the man was. Learning it was Isaac, she covered herself with a veil. The servant told Isaac all that had happened. And Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Genesis 24:67. Abraham lived 175 years before he died, full of years gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah beside Sarah. Isaac and Rebekah had no children for 20 years. Isaac prayed earnestly for his wife, and God answered. Rebekah conceived twins. The 2 children struggled within her, and God told her, 2 nations are in thy womb. Genesis 25:23. The older would serve the younger. When the time came, the first son born was red and hairy all over. They called him Esau. The second came out grasping his brother's heel. They called him Jacob. As the boys grew, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors. Jacob was quieter, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. One day Esau came in from the field. famished and found Jacob cooking a red stew. He begged for some. Jacob offered a trade, the stew for the birthright, the legal double portion and family authority belonging to the firstborn. Esau, ruled by his hunger in that moment, agreed. He did eat and drink, and rose up, and went his way. Thus, Esau despised his birthright. Genesis 25:34. God confirmed the Abrahamic covenant to Isaac as well. The same promises given to Abraham were now passed to his son. The promise was not just personal, it was generational. Isaac was old, and his eyes had grown dim. Believing his death was near, he called his firstborn Esau and asked him to hunt game and prepare a savory meal, after which Isaac would give him his blessing. Rebekah overheard. She loved Jacob and wanted the blessing for him. She devised a plan. She would prepare the food herself, dress Jacob in Esau's clothes, and cover his hands and neck with the skin of young goats, so that the touch would feel like Esau's. Jacob hesitated. What if his father discovered the deception? Cursed be thou, not blessed, was what he feared. But Rebekah took the curse upon herself, and so Jacob went in to his father, claiming to be Esau. Isaac was suspicious. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Genesis 27:22. But he blessed him. The blessing he gave was full and irrevocable, dominion, abundance, and the honor of his brothers. When Esau returned from hunting and discovered what had happened, he wept with a loud and bitter cry. Hast thou not reserved a blessing for me? Genesis 27:36. Isaac gave him what he could, but the primary blessing was gone. Esau hated Jacob for it and planned to kill him after their father's death. Rebekah sent Jacob away to her brother Laban in Haran to escape Esau's anger. On the journey, Jacob stopped for the night at a certain place and lay down with a stone for his pillow. He dreamed, and in the dream, a ladder reached from earth to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. At the top stood God himself, renewing the covenant promises, the land, the offspring, the blessing to all nations. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest. Genesis 28:15. Jacob woke up shaking. How dreadful is this place! This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Genesis 28:17. He set the stone up as a pillar and called the place Bethel, house of God. In Haran, Jacob met his match. His uncle Laban was every bit as calculating as Jacob had been. Jacob fell in love with Laban's younger daughter Rachel and agreed to work 7 years for her hand in marriage. The 7 years felt like nothing because of his love. But on the wedding night, Laban substituted his older daughter Leah under the veil. Jacob did not realize until morning. Laban's explanation was matter of fact. In this place, the older daughter must be married first. He offered Rachel too, for another 7 years of work. Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, but God saw that Leah was unloved and opened her womb. Leah bore Jacob 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel was barren and grieved, offering her servant Bilhah to Jacob. Bilhah bore Dan and Naphtali. Leah, no longer bearing children, offered her servant Zilpah, who bore Gad and Asher. Then Leah bore 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun, and a daughter, Dinah. Finally, God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her, and opened her womb. Genesis 30:22. She bore a son, and named him as Joseph. After 20 years with Laban, who had changed Jacob's wages 10 times and dealt with him dishonestly, God told Jacob it was time to return to the land of his fathers. He left secretly with his wives, children, and flocks. Laban pursued him, but God warned Laban in a dream to do Jacob no harm. They made a covenant and parted, but Jacob still had to face Esau. He was terrified. He sent gifts ahead, dividing his family and flocks into groups in case of attack. The night before the encounter, a man wrestled with Jacob until daybreak. Jacob would not let go. The man touched his hip and wrenched it out of its socket, and still Jacob held on, saying, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." Genesis 32:26. The man asked his name, Jacob, and then, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." Genesis 32:28. He limped into the next morning a changed man. He crossed the river and saw Esau coming with 400 men, and Esau ran to him, not to attack, to embrace. He fell on his brother's neck and wept. The brothers were reconciled. God appeared to Jacob again at Bethel and confirmed the new name, Israel. The 12 sons of Jacob would become the 12 tribes of a nation, God's chosen people, the children of Israel. Jacob had 12 sons, but Joseph was his favorite, the firstborn of his beloved Rachel. Jacob gave Joseph a coat of many colors, a mark of distinction that did not go unnoticed by his brothers. Joseph also dreamed, and the dreams were troubling to his family. Sheaves of grain bowing to his, the sun and moon, and 11 stars bowing to him. Even his father rebuked him, and yet Jacob kept the matter in mind. His brothers hated Joseph. When Jacob sent the young man out to check on them as they tended the flocks at Shechem, they saw him coming from far off and conspired against him. "Behold, this dreamer cometh." Genesis 37:19. Some wanted to kill him. Reuben intervened, throw him in a pit, not kill him, secretly planning to come back and rescue him. But while Reuben was away, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passed by on their way to Egypt. Judah suggested selling him instead of letting him die. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. They dipped his coat in goat's blood and brought it home to their father. Jacob was devastated. He tore his garments, put on sackcloth, and mourned his son for many days. "I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning." Genesis 37:35. He did not know that in Egypt, Joseph had been bought by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's guard. But the Lord was with Joseph. Genesis 39:2. He prospered in Potiphar's house. He was put in charge of everything. Then Potiphar's wife made advances toward him. Joseph refused day after day. "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Genesis 39:9. She persisted. One day she grabbed his garment. He fled, leaving it in her hand. She used the coat as false evidence, accusing Joseph of what she herself had attempted. Potiphar had him thrown into prison, and yet the Lord was with Joseph. Genesis 39:21. Even in prison, he found favor. The keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of the other prisoners. 2 of Pharaoh's officials, his cupbearer and his baker, were imprisoned with him and had dreams they could not explain. Joseph told them, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Genesis 48. He interpreted both dreams. The cupbearer would be restored in 3 days. The baker would be executed in 3 days. Both came true, exactly as Joseph said. Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him, to mention him to Pharaoh. But the cupbearer forgot. 2 full years passed. Then Pharaoh dreamed. He stood by a river and saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the water, then 7 gaunt and thin cows that swallowed up the 7 fat ones. He dreamed again. 7 full heads of grain on one stalk, then 7 thin heads scorched by the wind that swallowed the full ones. The morning came, and Pharaoh was troubled in his spirit. No one in Egypt could tell him the meaning, and the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Joseph was brought from the dungeon, cleaned up, and brought before Pharaoh. He gave God the credit before saying a word. "It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace." Genesis 41:16. The interpretation was sobering. 7 years of great abundance would come upon Egypt, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Joseph also offered a solution. Appoint a wise man to oversee the gathering and storage of grain during the plentiful years. Pharaoh looked at his officials and asked, "Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is?" Genesis 41:38. He looked at Joseph. "Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art." Genesis 41:39. In that moment, Joseph went from the dungeon to second in command over all of Egypt. Pharaoh put his own signet ring on Joseph's hand, clothed him in fine linen, hung a gold chain around his neck, and had him ride in the second chariot through the streets of Egypt. The man who had been betrayed, sold, falsely accused, and forgotten, had become the ruler of the most powerful nation on earth. The famine Joseph had foretold came upon all the earth. The 7 years of abundance had been stored carefully under Joseph's oversight, and now Egypt alone had grain when everywhere else was empty. People came from distant lands to buy from Egypt's supply, including 10 of Joseph's brothers, sent by Jacob when he heard there was grain in Egypt. They came and bowed before Joseph with their faces to the ground, not recognizing him. Joseph recognized them immediately. 20 years had passed. The dreams he had dreamed as a boy, sheaves bowing, stars bowing, were now fulfilled in the very men who had thrown him in a pit and sold him. Joseph did not reveal himself at once. He tested them. He accused them of being spies. He demanded they bring their youngest brother Benjamin next time. He kept Simeon as collateral. The brothers spoke among themselves. Not knowing Joseph understood. "We are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us." Genesis 42:21. The guilt they had carried for 20 years was surfacing. Reuben reminded them he had told them not to sin against the child. Jacob was devastated when they returned without Simeon, and with the requirement of sending Benjamin. He refused at first, but the famine pressed on, and eventually there was no choice. Judah personally pledged to be responsible for Benjamin. Jacob let him go, sending gifts and double money and a prayer. "God Almighty give you mercy before the man." Genesis 43:14. When the brothers returned with Benjamin, Joseph saw his only full brother and was so moved he had to leave the room and weep privately. He returned, composed himself, and served them a meal. He arranged his brothers in order of their age, and they marveled. How could this Egyptian lord know? He gave Benjamin 5 times as much food as the others. After sending them off with their grain, Joseph instructed his steward to place his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. He then sent the steward after them to accuse them of theft. The cup was found in Benjamin's sack. The brothers returned in despair, tearing their clothes. Joseph said, Benjamin must stay in Egypt as his slave. And then Judah, the same Judah who had suggested selling Joseph, came forward and gave one of the most moving speeches in all of Genesis. He explained what losing Benjamin would do to their father, who had already lost Joseph. For how shall I go up to my father, and the lad be not with me, lest peradventure I see the evil that shall come on my father. Genesis 44:34. He offered himself as a slave in Benjamin's place. Joseph could not hold it together any longer, and Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother, and he sought where to weep, and he entered into his chamber, and wept there. Genesis 43:30. He sent everyone else out, and wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him in the next room. Then he revealed himself to his brothers. I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Genesis 45:4. The brothers could not speak. They were terrified. But Joseph said something that has echoed through all the centuries since. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. Genesis 45:5. He saw it clearly now. What his brothers meant for evil, God had meant for good. Every betrayal, every imprisonment, every forgotten promise, God had been working through all of it to bring his people through the famine and into the future he had planned. Joseph sent his brothers home with wagons and provisions to bring their father and their families to Egypt. When Jacob heard that Joseph was alive, that he was ruler of all Egypt, his heart fainted. He could not believe it. But when he saw the wagons, his spirit revived. It is enough. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die. Genesis 45:28. God spoke to Jacob on the journey. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. Genesis 46:3. And so Israel went down, 70 souls in all, into the land of Egypt. When Joseph saw his father coming, he fell on his neck and wept for a long time. Jacob said, Now let me die, since I have seen thy face, because thou art yet alive. Genesis 46:30. The family was settled in the land of Goshen. Joseph sustained them through the famine. Jacob lived his last 17 years in Egypt, rich with the presence of his son. As death approached, he called his sons to him one by one and spoke prophetic blessings over each of them, blessings that would shape the destiny of the 12 tribes for generations to come. When Jacob died, Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept and kissed him. He had him embalmed and carried back to Canaan, where he was buried in the cave of Machpelah beside Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah. After their father was buried, the brothers were afraid Joseph might now turn on them. They sent word, perhaps fabricating a final request from their father, asking for forgiveness. Joseph wept when he heard it. And then he said words that are the heartbeat of the entire book. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Genesis 50:20. Joseph lived to be 110 years old. He saw his great-grandchildren, and before he died, He made his people swear an oath. When God comes to bring them out of Egypt, they must carry his bones with them. He was looking forward, all the way to a day he would not see, but believed with all his heart was coming. And Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Genesis 50:26. Genesis ends not with the promised land, but with a coffin in a foreign country. And yet, it ends with hope, because God keeps his promises. The story isn't over. It's only just beginning